Have you heard of the butterfly effect? The butterfly effect was the doctoral thesis written in 1963 by Edward Lorenz, and it was presented to the New York Academy of Sciences and laughed out of the place. It was crazy. The butterfly effect stated a butterfly could flap its wings on one side of the world and set molecules of air in motion that moved other molecules of air that then moved other molecules of air. Somewhere along the line, it could create weather patterns on the other side of the world. The butterfly effect. It was ridiculous. But it was interesting. And because it was interesting, it hung around forever in myth and urban legend and comic books and bad movies until finally, physics professors proved the butterfly effect was accurate and viable, and it worked every time. And not just with butterflies either, it worked with any form of moving matter, including people. They gave it the status of a law. Today, the butterfly effect in scientific circles is just like the law of gravity. Its name is the law of sensitive dependence upon initial conditions. Turns out it's just one of God's laws, one of God's principles. Now, curiously, principles always work. I mean, always. God's principles always work. And they work whether you know them or not. You know, you've heard ignorance of the law is no excuse. Well, ignorance of principle is no protection. Just because you don't understand the principle of gravity doesn't mean that if you stumble off a cliff, it's not still gonna be in effect. Right? I mean, and so there are principles that God has laid out for us that we ignore at our peril because they work whether we know them or not. Now, to understand the butterfly effect, I was in a hotel room. This was like 5 or 6 years ago. I was ironing the left sleeve of a white shirt. And I was about to go down and talk to a bunch of people, and the TV was on, and I was barely listening. I was barely, I was running into the room. I was hurrying, and ABC was on. I know it was ABC because I went back and said, "What the heck was that?" And they were doing this Person of the Week thing, and this was a Friday night because they always do. They still do that on Friday night. And so, but ABC does this person. They talk about how great somebody is and what they did, and gave them the Person of the Week award. And so I'm barely listening, and this guy says, "And so the Person of the Week for," and he gave the day. He said, "is Norman Borlaug." Man, when he said Norman Borlaug, I put the iron down. I went over in front of the TV set. My jaw's around my knees. Norman Borlaug, I didn't know who the dude was years ago, but I knew who he was now. I just didn't know he was still alive. He just died in Dallas several years ago, 96 when he died, but I knew who he was. He had, in the 1940s, hybridized corn and wheat for arid climates, and they had determined that throughout the decades across the world, they calculated that his work saved the lives from famine of over 2 billion people. The guy saved 2 billion lives. And for that, he was Person of the Week. And I'm sitting there thinking, what about, because I'm yelling at the TV, because I'm yelling Henry Wallace. Nobody said a word about, because I knew it wasn't Norman Borlaug who really saved the 2 billion people. It was a guy named Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was Vice President of the United States under Roosevelt. A lot of people think, ooh, what about Truman? Well, that's right, but remember, Roosevelt was elected 4 times, right? He had, curiously, 3 different vice presidents. He had Nance was one, Truman was the last one, but the middle one was the former Secretary of Agriculture, a man named Henry Wallace, who, while he was Vice President of the United States, used the power of that office to create a station in Mexico whose sole purpose was to figure out how to hybridize corn and wheat for arid climates. And he hired a young man named Norman Borlaug to run it. And Norman Borlaug got the Nobel Prize. And Norman Borlaug got Person of the Week. But when you think about it, it was Henry Wallace who saved the 2 billion people, wasn't it? Unless maybe it was George Washington Carver. You remember Carver, don't you, the peanut? One of the things people don't know about Carver, when he was 19 years old, a student at Iowa State, he had a dairy sciences professor who on Saturday and Sunday afternoon would allow his 6-year-old boy to go on botanical expeditions with this brilliant student. George Washington Carver was his babysitter. Basically, it was George Washington Carver that took this 6-year-old and pointed his life in a direction. It was George Washington Carver that took this 6-year-old Henry Wallace, long before he ever thought about being vice president of the United States, and put a vision in his life about plants and what they could do for humanity. It's amazing, isn't it, to think of George Washington Carver flapping his butterfly wings all those years with a peanut. 266 things he developed from the peanut that we still use today. For years, he flapped his wings with the sweet potato. 88 things he developed from the sweet potato that we still use today. And while nobody was even looking, he took a couple of weekends and flapped his wings with a 6-year-old and just happened to save the lives of 2 billion people and counting. So when you think about it, maybe George Washington Carver should have been Person of the Week. Unless maybe it would have been the farmer from Diamond, Missouri. A man named Moses lived in a slave state, but he didn't believe in slavery, so this was a problem for these psychopaths like Quantrill's raiders who would come through farms and villages at night, burning and destroying. And one January night, Quantrill's raiders came through Moses' farm and they burned the barn. And they shot several people, and they drug off a lady named Mary Washington, who refused to let go of her infant son, George. Now, Moses, probably like me, kind of crazy and disorganized, but he had a wife named Susan who was very organized. And Susan immediately went to work sending messages out and messengers here and trying to create a meeting with Quantrill's raiders. And 48 hours later, she had the meeting set. And she sent her husband, Moses, several hours north on a black horse to a crossroads in Kansas, where in the middle of the night at the appointed time, he met 4 of Quantrill's raiders who showed up on horseback, carrying torches with flour sacks over their head and the eye holes cut out. And there, Moses traded the last horse they had left on that farm for what they threw him in a burlap sack. And as he caught it and they thundered off, he went to the ground. And there in the darkness with that breath coming out against the black night, he pulled out of that burlap sack a cold, naked, almost dead baby boy. And he jerked open his coat and his shirts and he put the baby in next to his skin and covered him up. And he walked that baby out. And all the way home. And the next afternoon when he stumbled through the door and put that baby in the arms of his wife, they went to the fireplace to begin to massage the child and try to get his blood going, and get him to cry, anything. And they told God, right then they pledged to God that they would raise that baby as their own. They promised God they would educate that baby to honor his mother, who they knew was already dead. And that was the moment they told that baby they would give him their name. And that's how Moses and Susan Carver came to raise that little baby, George Washington. So when you think about it, maybe it was a farmer's wife from Diamond, Missouri, who saved 2 billion people. Unless, I mean, we could do that all night, right? How far back could we go? How far back could we go to show whose move at what time really was the move that saved 2 billion people, a number that continues to increase as we sit here? How far back could we go? And how far forward could we go in your life? How far forward could we go to show the difference you will make with the moves that you make and the actions that you take or don't take? Because everything you do or don't do matters forever.